The offer arrived like a whisper in a storm, a quiet anomaly in the loud chaos of Clara Hayes's life. It lay in her Brooklyn apartment's mailbox, nestled between a final notice for a student loan payment and a takeout menu, a thick, cream-colored envelope of heavy cardstock. There was no return address, only her name, Clara E. Hayes, inscribed in an elegant, looping script that felt like a relic from another century. Inside, the proposition was as stunning as it was absurd. It had begun 2 weeks prior with a cryptic email from a shell corporation, Ethelred Holdings, requesting her services for a high-net-worth client. The language was sterile, corporate, but the inquiry was specific. They needed the best American Sign Language interpreter in the tri-state area, one with a background in trauma-informed communication. Flattered but wary, Clara had replied. This led to a video interview with a stone-faced lawyer whose questions were more about her discretion and her past than her professional qualifications. He wanted to know if she had close family, a talkative roommate, an overactive social media presence. She had none of the above. Her life was a quiet, contained orbit of work, her small Carroll Gardens apartment, and the heavy weight of memory. Apparently, she was the perfect candidate. The letter was a formal offer from a recruitment firm she'd never heard of, a firm that clearly catered to a different echelon of society. The job, to serve as the private, full-time interpreter for Seraphina Moretti, the 19-year-old sister of the reclusive magnate, Dante Moretti. The six-figure salary made her sit down. She read the number again, her breath catching in her throat. It was more money than she'd ever imagined earning in a decade, a sum that could erase the mountain of debt her mother's illness had left behind, a sum that could finally buy her peace. But the accompanying non-disclosure agreement, 10 pages of dense, threatening legalese, felt more like an indictment than a contract. It forbade her from disclosing anything: the nature of her work, the layout of the Moretti properties, the state of Seraphina's health, her very existence. It was a contract designed to erase her from the world for the duration of her employment. Clara, accustomed to the fluorescent sterility of hospital rooms and the boisterous energy of public schools, felt a primal chill snake down her spine. This wasn't a job, it was an abdication of her life. Yet the final notice on her counter was a stark reminder of her reality. Brooklyn wasn't cheap, and the memory of her mother's fading smile in a hospital bed that cost a fortune was a scar that still ached. She folded the letter, her decision made with a grim sense of finality. She would walk into the lion's den, but she would not let it devour her. She would take the job. The final meeting was to be held at the Citadel. It wasn't a building, it was a monument to wealth and paranoia, a fortress of black glass and steel that clawed at the Manhattan skyline, arrogant and untouchable. The penthouse consumed the top 2 floors. A private elevator, operated by a guard with a discreet earpiece and impassive eyes, lifted her in unnerving silence. The ascent was so smooth it felt like floating, until the steel doors slid open to reveal a space that was both vast and suffocating. The floors were polished black marble that reflected the city lights like a dark, fractured mirror. The furniture was minimalist and architectural, more like sculptures in a private museum than pieces meant for human comfort. The air smelled of aged leather, polished wood, and something else, something intangible and absolute: power. Dante Moretti stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, a silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city. He surveyed his domain not with pleasure, but with the grim vigilance of a warlord on his battlements. When he turned, Clara felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. He was in his early 30s, with thick black hair cut with military precision and a jawline that looked sharp enough to draw blood. The bespoke charcoal suit he wore fit perfectly across broad shoulders, the kind built not just in a gym, but through generations of command. But it was his eyes that truly arrested her. An icy, piercing blue, they swept over her with a swift, efficient coldness that betrayed nothing and saw everything. It was a gaze that didn't just look at you, it assessed you, weighed you, and found you wanting. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice a low, even baritone, devoid of any warmth. "Thank you for coming." He didn't offer a hand. Clara hadn't expected him to. His stillness was absolute, a predator's economy of motion. "Mr. Moretti," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. A young woman emerged from a darkened hallway, moving with the silent, weightless grace of a phantom. Seraphina Moretti. She had the same raven hair and startling blue eyes as her brother, but where Dante was glacial ice, she was fragile, fractured glass. Her eyes were wide, taking in everything with a pained, watchful intensity, as if the world were too loud, too bright. She wore a simple white dress, its purity a stark contrast to the oppressive, dark luxury of the room. She seemed less a resident of this space and more a beautiful, haunted captive. "This is Seraphina," Dante said. The change in his voice was nearly imperceptible, but Clara, a student of nuance, caught it. A slight softening of the hard edges, a microgram of warmth. Clara turned her full attention to the girl, offering a smile she hoped was disarming. "Hi, Seraphina. I'm Clara." She lifted her hands, her fingers moving with the fluid, practiced grace of a musician. "It's nice to meet you." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear entered Seraphina's eyes. A spark of recognition, of light in the vast emptiness. She gave a slight hesitant nod. "The NDA was clear," Dante continued, his focus snapping back to business, the brief moment of warmth gone. "You'll be based at our estate on Long Island, 5 days a week. A car will collect you each morning at 7. You will not speak to any staff other than myself, Seraphina, and Victor, my uncle. You will not bring personal electronics into the house. A secure phone will be provided for emergencies." The rules were delivered like orders, each one another bar in the cage being constructed around her. "And my role exactly?" Clara asked, forcing herself to meet his chilling gaze. The job description was deliberately vague. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly, a penetrating look that made her feel as if he were scanning her very soul for weaknesses. "Your job isn't to translate, Ms. Hayes. There will be no business meetings, no phone calls for you to interpret." He paused, letting the silence stretch, a tactical pressure she felt in her bones. "Your job is to listen." The drive to the Long Island estate the following Monday was a silent, surreal journey. The driver, a mountain of a man who introduced himself only as Marco, didn't speak a word. The windows of the armored town car were tinted so darkly that the world outside seemed muted and distant. Clara felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were passing through a membrane into another reality, leaving her small, predictable life behind in the rearview mirror. The Moretti estate wasn't a house, it was a principality, a high stone wall topped with discreet security cameras, enclosed acres of perfectly manicured lawns that rolled down to the gray, churning waters of the Long Island Sound. The mansion itself was a sprawling masterpiece of old-world stone and modern glass, beautiful and imposing in equal measure. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out and its occupants in. Her first few days passed in a state of suspended animation. The staff moved like ghosts, their faces professionally blank, their presence fleeting. They would appear with meals on silver trays and disappear without a word. The silence of the house was profound, a living entity that pressed in on her from all sides. It was broken only by the distant crash of waves and the mournful cry of gulls. She spent her time with Seraphina in the cavernous library, a 2-story room where thousands of leather-bound books stood like silent sentinels on dark mahogany shelves. Seraphina rarely acknowledged her. She read or sketched haunting, abstract figures in a charcoal pad, or simply stared out the tall, arched windows at the unforgiving sea. Her silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. Clara was patient. Her work had taught her that trauma builds its own defenses, its own timeline. Trust was a seed that would only grow in stillness and safety. She didn't push. She simply existed in Seraphina's space, a calm, steady presence. She would read a book, her hands occasionally moving to sign a question or a comment about the story, an offering cast into the silence with no expectation of a response. This character reminds me of the sea today, beautiful but hiding something deep and sad. Seraphina never replied, but Clara sometimes saw her gaze flicker towards her hands, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. On the 4th morning, the breakthrough came. Seraphina set down her charcoal pencil, the sharp sound echoing in the stillness. She looked directly at Clara, her blue eyes clear and filled with a sudden, desperate intent. Then her hands began to move. They weren't just forming signs. They were weaving a tapestry, a complex, emotive ballet of fingers, palms, and wrists that was more art than language. Clara, with all her expertise, leaned forward, her professional focus sharpening into something more intense. Fascination. This was not a conversation. This was a performance. This was a story. Seraphina began her tale, her expression transforming, becoming that of a bard reciting an ancient epic. Once upon a time, her fingers sang with a sorrowful grace. In a kingdom shrouded by an endless fog, there lived a princess who had lost her voice. She lived in a grand castle of polished stone and shimmering glass, beside her brother, a mighty and fearsome dragon. The dragon loved the princess more than his own life, more than his own hoard of gold. He had vowed to protect her from the ravenous wolves that prowled the woods beyond the castle walls. Clara watched, mesmerized, her heart beating an unsteady rhythm against her ribs. She translated silently in her head, the formal structure of ASL melting away into the raw emotion of the narrative. The king and queen, you see, had been slain by the wolves from the forbidden forest. That is what the dragon believed, and so he sealed the castle gates, convinced that the world outside was a place of endless, predatory danger, and he alone could keep the princess safe. The narrative was so vivid, so imbued with a deep, personal grief, that Clara felt a lump form in her throat. But the dragon did not know. Seraphina's hands moved faster now, frantic and sharp, that the true danger was not outside. It was inside the castle walls. A treacherous wizard, one who had once been the king's most trusted advisor, had secretly laid a curse upon the princess. It was he who had unbarred the gates for the wolves that fateful bloody night. He whispered poison into the dragon's ear, feeding his rage, directing his fire towards the forest, all while he, the wizard, pulled the strings of the entire kingdom. The princess knew the truth. She had seen it all, but the wizard's curse had locked the words in her throat, turning her voice to dust. All she could do was tell her story through the silent dance of her hands, praying that one day someone would finally understand the song. The story ended. Seraphina's hands dropped to her lap, her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if she had just surfaced from a deep dive. She looked utterly drained. Clara sat in the heavy silence, the unspoken words of the fairy tale still echoing in the vast, empty spaces of her mind. A beautiful, tragic story, a brilliant, intricate coping mechanism for a deeply traumatized soul. At least that's what she told herself it was. At first, in the days that followed, the library became Clara's world, a silent theater where Seraphina was the sole performer. The fairy tale continued, spinning out from her hands in a torrent of silent, desperate poetry. It was no longer a simple story, but a sprawling epic filled with allegories so specific, so painfully detailed, that Clara's initial assessment of it as a mere coping mechanism began to feel naive, almost foolishly optimistic. Seraphina's hands described the wizard's cunning. He didn't rule with overt cruelty, but with soft-spoken manipulations. He would bring the grieving dragon maps of the forbidden forest, pointing out the supposed dens of the wolves who had slain his parents. He would stoke the dragon's rage with fabricated tales of their savagery, all while his own power grew unchecked within the castle walls. He isolated the princess, convincing the dragon that her fragility required absolute seclusion, that her silence was a symptom of a madness only he could manage. "She is a broken thing," the wizard would tell the dragon, his gestures in the story laced with a cloying, false sympathy. "She needs my care. She needs our protection from the truth of what the world did to her." Clara meticulously transcribed every sign, every nuanced expression. She filled notebooks with the story, her own annotations scribbled in the margins. Wizard's smile does not reach eyes. Dragon's grief blinds him to everything else. Princess's silence, a prison, not a sickness. The story was becoming an obsession, a cipher she felt compelled to solve. She started seeing its themes reflected in the oppressive quiet of the estate. The guards were the dragon's scales, an impenetrable armor. The stone walls were the castle's ramparts, and Seraphina was the princess, trapped not by a curse, but by a truth so terrible it had stolen her voice. The first tangible piece of the puzzle clicked into place on a Thursday afternoon. Victor Russo, Dante's uncle and advisor, paid one of his regular visits to the estate. He arrived with a warm smile and a gift for Seraphina, a rare leather-bound edition of Edgar Allan Poe's collected works. "For my little raven," he said, his voice a smooth, avuncular rumble. He presented the book to Seraphina, who accepted it with a polite but distant nod. He turned his attention to Clara. "And how is our patient today, Ms. Hayes? Any progress?" The word patient grated on Clara, but she kept her expression neutral. "Seraphina is very creative. She has a brilliant imagination." "Ah, yes. Her stories," Victor said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "A world of her own. Her mind built it to protect herself after the tragedy. We've had the best doctors, of course. They all say the same thing. In time, perhaps, she will find her way back." He smiled, a sad, benevolent expression that seemed utterly genuine. He was the picture of a concerned, heartbroken guardian. He then moved closer to Seraphina, who sat by the window, her fingers tracing the gold leaf on the book's cover. "My poor girl," he murmured, gently patting her cheek. "Don't you worry. Uncle Victor will always be here to look after you." And that's when Clara saw it. For a single fleeting microsecond, as his gaze met Seraphina's, the mask of kindly concern vanished. It was replaced by a look of such cold, possessive control that the air in Clara's lungs turned to ice. It was a look that said, "You are mine. Your silence is mine. Your story is mine." Then just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, hidden again behind the warm grandfatherly smile. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her blood ran cold. It was the exact look Seraphina's hands had described when she'd signed about the wizard asserting his power over the cursed princess. His eyes held no love. Seraphina had signed just the day before. Only ownership. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Clara lay awake in her sterile, impersonal guest suite, the house groaning around her under the weight of its secrets. The fairy tale was no longer a story. It was a testimony. Seraphina wasn't creating a fantasy. She was reporting a crime, using the only language she had left. Clara got out of bed and spread her notebooks across the floor. The story of the wizard, the dragon, and the princess lay before her, a roadmap of a decade-old conspiracy. The urge to flee, to pack her bags and disappear back into the anonymity of her Brooklyn life, was a physical ache. The NDA wasn't just a contract, it was a potential death sentence. She was an accessory after the fact to a truth she hadn't even fully understood until now. She was an employee of the Moretti family, an organization the newspapers euphemistically called a powerful import-export business, but which everyone knew was the modern incarnation of the mob. She had willingly walked into this gilded cage, and now the door had slammed shut behind her. But every time she thought of running, the image of Seraphina's face would flash in her mind. Not the fragile, haunted girl, but the fierce, intelligent storyteller, her hands weaving a desperate lifeline in the suffocating silence. How could she leave her? How could she abandon that silent plea for help? She was the only person in the world who could hear it. Her internal conflict was a raging storm, made all the more complicated by Dante. He remained a distant, intimidating figure, but she was beginning to see the cracks in his icy facade. She saw it in the way his shoulders would relax ever so slightly when he entered the library, and saw Seraphina was calm. She saw it in the brief, unguarded moments he would watch his sister from the doorway, his face a mask of profound, helpless grief. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man drowning in sorrow, clinging to the wrong wreckage. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her room, Clara wandered into the main living area. The house was quiet, the staff having long since retired to their own quarters. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She hadn't expected to see anyone, but Dante was there, standing before the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a bespoke suit. He was in dark trousers and a simple gray cashmere sweater that softened his formidable frame, making him look younger, more vulnerable. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply gestured with his glass toward the decanter on a nearby table. "Bourbon, help yourself." "Thank you, but I'm fine," she said, remaining a safe distance away. They stood in silence for a long moment, The only sounds the hiss of the fire and the distant cry of a foghorn out on the sound. She seems to like you, Dante said finally, his gaze fixed on the flames. She hasn't spent this much consistent time with anyone since before. She's an incredible storyteller, Clara replied carefully. Dante turned his head, his blue eyes catching the firelight. Is that what she does? Tell stories? It's how she communicates, Clara said. She builds worlds with her hands. It's beautiful in a way. There was nothing beautiful about what happened to her, he stated, his voice flat and hard. She was 9 years old. She saw our parents murdered in our own home. The doctors called it elective mutism, a choice her brain made to protect her from a memory too horrific to speak aloud. They said there is no cure, only time. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, the silence stretching again. Clara found herself studying an old photograph on the mantelpiece, one she hadn't noticed before. It was a family portrait, a handsome, smiling man with Dante's eyes, a beautiful woman with a radiant, joyful smile, and 2 children. A young Dante, looking serious even then, stood with a protective arm around his sister, a 9-year-old Seraphina who was laughing, her face full of a light that was now gone. That was taken a month before, Dante said, his voice so low she barely heard him. At my father's birthday, my mother had just told a terrible joke. Seraphina was the only one who laughed. He moved to stand beside her, closer than he'd ever been. Clara could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint scent of bourbon and something else. Something uniquely him, a clean, sharp scent like winter air. Victor says I have my father's eyes, he murmured, his gaze locked on the photograph. But Seraphina, she had my mother's smile. I haven't seen it in 10 years. In that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder in the firelight, the wall of ice around him seemed to melt away completely. Clara didn't see a mob boss. She saw a grieving brother, a lonely son, a man who had been forced to become a dragon to protect the last remnant of his family, all while being blind to the real threat. The raw pain in his voice was a physical thing, and it resonated with the old, familiar ache of her own losses. She realized a truth that was even more dangerous than Seraphina's secret. Her feelings for this man were becoming hopelessly, terrifyingly complicated. It was one thing to feel pity for a stranger, but it was another thing entirely to feel a pull. A deep, magnetic draw to a man who was both a victim and a monster, a man whose entire life was built on a lie she now had the power to shatter. Her presence in this house was no longer just a job. It had become a tightrope walk over a canyon, and she didn't know which side held the greater danger, the fall or the man waiting for her on the other side. Victor Russo moved faster and with more finality than Clara could have ever anticipated. He hadn't just been suspicious. He had been watching, waiting for the precise moment her knowledge tipped from being a curiosity into a liability. That moment had arrived. It began, as insidious things often do, with a mundane disruption to her routine. On a gray Friday morning, the familiar, gleaming town car that ferried her to the estate was absent. In its place sat a black sedan, its windows tinted to an opaque, menacing sheen. A driver she didn't recognize, a man with a thick neck and a flattened nose, stepped out. "Regular cars in for service," he grunted, the words a clumsy, ill-fitting lie. "Mr. Russo sent me." A knot of ice formed in Clara's stomach. Every instinct, honed by years of navigating the subtle currents of human intention, screamed at her that this was wrong. But what could she do? Refuse to get in? Make a scene on the quiet, tree-lined street? That would only confirm their fears and perhaps hasten the inevitable. With a deep, steadying breath, she slid into the back seat, the door closing behind her with the heavy, definitive thud of a vault. She knew immediately she had made a fatal error. The car didn't turn towards the expressway to Long Island. It headed east, towards the skeletal remains of the Brooklyn waterfront, a forgotten landscape of derelict industrial parks and decaying piers that jutted into the gray water like broken teeth. "This isn't the right way," she said, her voice a model of forced calm. The driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Mr. Russo has a few questions for you, wants a more private setting." The ice in her stomach spread through her veins. She had severely underestimated Victor. He wasn't just a schemer. He was a predator who had sensed her discovery and was now moving to eliminate the threat. The sedan rumbled over cracked pavement and pulled into a cavernous, dilapidated warehouse. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust, damp decay, and the faint, salty tang of the nearby river. Victor was waiting for her in the center of the vast, empty space. He stood bathed in a single beam of dusty light from a grimy skylight, no longer the kindly grandfather, but a figure of chilling authority. His smile was gone, replaced by the cold patience of an executioner. "A clever girl," Victor said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "Too clever for your own good. Seraphina has been telling you her stories, hasn't she? Her little fairy tales." Clara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she remained silent, her face a mask of defiant composure. "Silence is a confession," Victor sighed, a theatrical gesture of disappointment. "It's a pity, really. Dante has grown quite fond of you. I can see the appeal. But my loyalty, you see, is to the stability of this family. And you, my dear girl, have become a threat to that stability." The driver, Marco's replacement, drew a heavy pistol from beneath his jacket. The silencer attached to its barrel was long and black and utterly terrifying. Clara knew with a sickening certainty that she had only seconds to live. She couldn't fight them, couldn't outrun them. Her body was a trap, but her mind, her hands, they were her own. She looked past Victor, past the man with the gun, and saw it. A tiny, blinking red light high on a steel beam in the corner. A security camera. Old, probably forgotten, but active. It was a 1 in a million chance. It was the only chance she had. She took a breath and looked directly at Victor, a gesture of seeming defiance. And then she began to sign. "The dragon will never forgive the wizard for harming his treasure." Victor's brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell are you doing? Praying with your hands?" But Clara wasn't signing for him. She was signing for the unblinking red eye of the camera. She was performing for an audience of one, praying that he was watching. In his penthouse, Dante stared at the bank of security monitors, a storm of fury gathering in his eyes. He had trackers and hidden cameras in all the family vehicles, a paranoid precaution born from a life where betrayal was a constant shadow. When Clara's car had deviated from its prescribed route, the system had instantly flagged it. He'd watched the entire scene unfold, his hand clenching into a white-knuckled fist as he saw Victor step out of the shadows. He had patched in the audio, his blood turning to ice as he heard the thinly veiled threats. At first, he didn't understand what Clara was doing with her hands. It looked like a gesture of desperate, meaningless defiance. But then he recognized the fluid, precise movements, the signs: dragon, wizard, treasure. They were words from Seraphina's story, the story Clara had been transcribing for weeks, the notebooks she kept locked in her room, the story he had dismissed as the fantasy of a broken mind. A cold, horrifying clarity washed over him, shattering a decade of lies in a single devastating instant. He saw it all: Victor's feigned concern, his constant presence, his subtle manipulation of Seraphina. The fairy tale wasn't a fantasy, it was a code, it was the truth. And Clara, in what she believed were her final moments, was sending him the key. "Luca!" he roared into the intercom, his voice a raw, primal sound of fury. "Get the team! Warehouse 7, Red Hook Docks, move now!" In the warehouse, the driver leveled his gun at Clara's heart. She closed her eyes, a single silent tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. A screech of tires from outside was the only warning. It was followed by a deafening metallic scream as a black, armored SUV smashed through the warehouse's corrugated steel door, sending rust and debris flying. Men in tactical gear, Dante's elite guard, flooded in like a black tide, their weapons already raised. Red laser sights dancing across the chests of Victor's men. But Dante was the first one through the breach. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying to behold. He didn't even glance at Victor. His eyes, blazing with a terrifying protective fire, were only on her. In 2 long strides, he was in front of her, pulling her behind him, shielding her with his own body as if he could absorb a bullet himself. "Dante," Victor began, trying to regain his composure, the mask of civility slipping back into place. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding." "Shut up, Victor," Dante snarled, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned his head slightly, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at Clara. "Are you okay?" Clara could only nod, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Good," he said. He then turned his full, wrathful attention to the man he had once called uncle. "Now," he said, drawing his own pistol with a fluid, deadly grace, "you're going to tell me about Seraphina's story." The true confrontation, however, was not one of bullets, but of power. Dante convened an emergency meeting of the family's capos at the Citadel. It was a trial, not in a court of law, but in a court of loyalty and blood. Victor was dragged into the center of the room, bruised but still spitting defiance. "This is insanity," he yelled, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "The boy is compromised. He's being manipulated by that interpreting whore." "Then let's hear from the final witness," Dante said, his voice as cold and hard as the marble floor. The grand doors to the room opened. Luca wheeled Seraphina inside, her face pale but her eyes burning with a righteous fire that had been absent for 10 years. Clara walked beside her, her hand resting reassuringly on Seraphina's shoulder. "Translate," Dante commanded, his voice a quiet, final judgment. And Clara did. Before the stony-faced council of the most powerful men in the New York underworld, she gave voice to Seraphina's silence. As Seraphina's hands began to move, they told not a fairy tale, but a raw, unflinching testimony. They spoke of the night she heard her mother's screams, of the sight of her father falling, of the face of the man who had pulled the trigger. The same man who now stood before them, his face draining of all color. Clara's voice, clear and steady, filled the room, translating not just the signs, but the decade of terror, grief, and suffocating silence behind them. She conveyed the horror of a 9-year-old girl watching her world burn, and the chilling finality of a single finger raised to the lips in a threat that had stolen her voice for a decade. When it was over, a profound tomb-like silence descended upon the room. The truth in its raw and terrible power was undeniable. Victor Russo, the uncle, the trusted advisor, stood exposed. He had been defeated not by a rival's gun, but by the silent memory of a child. The justice of their world was swift. Victor Russo vanished from the face of the earth, his name erased from the family's history. The decade-long war with the rival family, a war built on Victor's lie, ended in a tense but final negotiation. An uneasy peace, bought with blood and secrets, settled over Dante's empire. Weeks later, in the library on Long Island, Dante stood watching his sister. She was sitting by the open French doors leading to the garden, a sketchbook in her lap. For the first time since Clara had met her, Seraphina was sketching not abstract nightmares, but the vibrant colors of the blooming roses outside. She looked up as Clara entered, and for the first time in 10 years, she smiled. A real, genuine smile that held the ghost of their mother's radiance. The weight had been lifted. "She seems, Clara began, unable to find the right word. "Free," Dante finished for her, his voice quiet. He turned from the doorway to face Clara. "Thanks to you. You gave her a voice when she had none." "She always had a voice," Clara corrected softly. "She just needed someone to finally listen." A comfortable silence settled between them, the first of its kind. "It's over," Dante said, stating a fact that felt both momentous and surreal. "Victor and his loyalists have been dealt with. Any threat to you or Seraphina is gone. You're free. Your contract is terminated. Luca will wire the remainder of your salary in a substantial bonus. You can go home." Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. Freedom. It was all she had ever wanted. So why did it now feel like an exile? "So that's it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dante finally moved to face her directly. The ice in his blue eyes had thawed, revealing a landscape of exhaustion, regret, and a raw vulnerability that startled her. "I built my entire world on a lie, Clara," he said. "I spent 10 years hunting the wrong enemy. Everything I thought was righteous was just vengeance for a phantom. Now I have to rebuild it all on the truth." He took a step closer. "But I can't do it alone. I need a compass, someone to remind me of the difference between justice and revenge." He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth from his body, a stark contrast to the coldness he projected to the world. "I can't offer you a normal life. I can't promise you peace or safety. My world will always be filled with shadows. I know, she whispered, but I can offer you honesty, he continued, his voice dropping to an intense, earnest plea. My protection and my absolute loyalty. I'm offering a new pact. Not an employment contract, a partnership. He gently took her hand, his strong fingers enveloping hers. Stay, Clara. Stay and be my compass. Clara looked into his eyes and saw the lonely, grieving man beneath the ruthless mob boss. She saw a man standing at a precipice, desperate to build a future that wasn't dictated by the ghosts of his past. She glanced at Seraphina, who was watching them from the doorway, a hopeful, knowing smile on her face. She had come here for a job, but she had found a cause. She had entered their world as a translator of words, but she had become a translator of souls. All right, Dante, she said, her fingers tightening around his, but on one condition. A flicker of surprise and perhaps amusement crossed his face. I'm keeping my apartment in Brooklyn, she stated, a small, genuine smile finally gracing her own lips. And you have to come over for dinner, at least once a week. Real, homemade lasagna, not the kind from a five-star chef. For the very first time, Clara Hayes saw Dante Moretti truly smile. It wasn't a broad grin, but it was real, and it had the force of a sunrise chasing away the shadows from his face. It's a pact, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she now understood was not weakness, but strength. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the waters of the Sound in hues of gold and rose. An uncertain, dangerous future awaited them. But for the first time, neither of them would have to face it alone. The silent pact was over. A new one, built on truth and a resilient love forged in the heart of darkness, was just beginning.